Hi. If you'd have happened across this video out of the blue, I were to explain what's going on, you've arrived at part two of a commentary video on James Joyce's Ulysses. We're dealing with a chapter called Scylla and Charybdis, and if you have just arrived out of the blue, my advice is to watch part one first of all. I'll try and put some sort of link to that. But here we are on page 239 in the Penguin edition, and we are just about to start the paragraph at the bottom of the page. So I'm Russell Raphael from North London Ulysses, reading James Joyce's Ulysses. Thanks.
Sumptuous and stagnant exaggeration of murder. Right, Stephen, this is interior monologue. This is Stephen's consideration of both Hamlet and perhaps the Boer Wars in The Absent-Minded Beggar, but mainly Hamlet. And then he says out loud that Robert Greene called him a deathsman of the soul. Robert Greene was contemporary of Shakespeare, didn't think much of him, perhaps out of envy. But did he write that did he describe Shakespeare as the deathsman of the soul? Anyway, but Stephen continues, not for nothing was he a butcher's son, wielding the sledded poleaxe and spitting in his palm. 9 lives are taken off for his father's one, our Father who art in purgatory. So Stephen is saying Shakespeare, excuse me, oh dear. If I knew how to edit that out, I would, but as I don't, I'll press on. Stephen is saying that the Hamlet is an extremely violent play. The 9 lives. So his father comes to him, his Father who art in purgatory, because he says, I am condemned to walk for a time until my soul is cleansed, or whatever he said, purged in fire. And as revenge for the death of his father, the king, 9 lives, I think he said 9 lives are taken off for his father's one. So the implication, so who are the 9 lives? Well, there's lots of people killed in Hamlet, in the play, and apparently it adds up to 9. And that he's saying that Shakespeare was the son of a butcher, used to killing things. He was he grew up in violent surroundings, and that was part of his experience. Was Shakespeare the son of a butcher? I thought his father was a glover. Perhaps he had lots of jobs, went from one to another. I suppose the leather and the slaughterhouse sort of goes together. Khaki Hamlets don't hesitate to shoot. The blood-bolted shambles in Act 5 is a forecast of the concentration camps sung by Mr. Swinburne. So he's sort of conflating the play Shakespeare and Kipling's The Absent-Minded Beggar and Swinburne's poem. I can't think what it was called. Is it Trinity or something? So Swinburne wrote about some British atrocities in the Boer Wars, although Swinburne wrote from the point of view of the British. He was very pro-British, pro-Boer War, and Kipling as well is regarded as Kipling is regarded as the sort of the poem of imperialist, the poet of imperialist Britain. I must say, when I read The Absent-Minded Beggar, I'm not so sure. It seems to be more that about poor people that don't get much of a choice. They're conscripted to fight. Spare a thought for those that they're now, their lives and the lives of their families. If the soldier is incapacitated, he's content just to beg for the rest of his life. Please be charitable. He's done his bit for the country, but not that he had much of a choice in that, is the way I read it. Anyway, lots of blood and guts, and he's saying Hamlet is no different, and that comes out of Shakespeare's upbringing. Right. That whelps and damns the murderous foes whom none but we have spared. That's from the Swinburne poem. And of course, our book starts with Swinburne, with Mulligan extolling the virtues of Algernon Swinburne and the grey sweet mother of the sea, and likening it to Dublin Bay. Between the Saxon Smile and Yankee York, the Devil and Deep Sea, the Devil and Deep Sea makes us think of between, so Scylla and Charybdis, the choice, and the sort of the Irish sort of being caught between the Saxon Smile, so Haynes' Smile, that even though he's claiming to be very pro-Irish, that's sort of his hobby. It's a plaything. He's British. And the American journalist that came to interview George Russell, similar. Eglinton then says he will have it that Hamlet is a ghost story. So he's explaining this. He's bringing Richard Best up to speed in the conversation, and rather in a derogatory way, he compares Stephen's Hamlet theory to the fat boy in Pickwick, that he just wants to, he's claiming it's all a ghost story. He wants to scare us like the fat boy in Pickwick Papers wants to make our flesh creep. And Stephen thinks, list, oh list, as he quotes from Hamlet, the ghost calling his son Hamlet to him to listen. My flesh hears him creeping, hears, if thou didst ever. Well, that's part of what the ghost says, isn't it, in Act 1, Scene 5, I think, of Hamlet, when, was it, if thou didst ever love thy father, you will enact this revenge for me. And here we get into, at the moment, they're thinking, well, how is the Hamlet story analogous with Shakespeare's real life? Yes, Shakespeare's father has died, but what's that got to do with it? And now we're getting a bit more into it with the next paragraph. Stephen says, because we're talking about, yes, it is a ghost story. And Stephen says, and what is a ghost? It might be, we think of it as someone dead, but it could be someone that has faded into impalpability through absence as well as death. And Shakespeare has left his home in Stratford and come to London. And Stephen makes the point that in 1590 or whenever it was, Elizabethan London lay as far from Stratford as corrupt Paris in 1904 lies from virgin Dublin, because methods of transport have speeded up and what have you. So who is this ghost at the beginning of Hamlet? Who does it actually represent? And we're going to try and, Stephen's beginning to try and say, this is Shakespeare. He might not be dead, but it's as though he is, because he's left Stratford for London. And then John Eglinton shifted his spare body, leaning back to judge. So Stephen feels, well, I've piqued his interest. Okay, now I'm going to build my theory. And Stephen paints us a picture with this. It is this hour of the day in mid-June, i.e. around 2:30 in the afternoon. The flag is up on the playhouse, by which we know if the flag was up, there is a play that's going to be performed that afternoon. The bear Sackerson growls in the pit near it, Paris Garden. There was bear baiting at that time. There were bear. The famous one was Sackerson. The canvas climbers who sailed with Drake drew their sausages among the groundlings. If you didn't want to pay as much money to sit down, you stood in front of the stage. You still can. Little secret: if it's the best value for a cultural afternoon or evening in London. Costs you £5. You stand right in front of the stage. Absolutely brilliant. Couldn't recommend it highly enough. Local colour, work in all you know, make them accomplices. He then depicts Shakespeare has left the Huguenot's house where he was renting in Silver Street, walks by the Swan Mews along the riverbank, but he doesn't feed the swans, he's got other things on his mind. Composition of place, Ignatius Loyola, make haste to help me. Well, I'm afraid that does make my flesh creep, because I think that that goes back to the portrait of the artist and the retreat that the boys are forced to go to, where they are told for several days solid about hell. It's one of the scariest parts of anything I've ever read, I think. It's about 10 pages in a portrait of the artist. And these priests are telling the boys in terribly descriptive terms. Ignatius Loyola, the founder of the Jesuit movement, hundreds of years earlier, but composition of place, the way they describe hell is in great detail. And then the play begins, and then here he is, there's a player, and it's the ghost comes on the stage. The king, a king and no king. Well, he's the king of Denmark, but he's no king because he's now dead. But who's playing him? Who is the actor? Well, he says the player is Shakespeare, who studied Hamlet all the years of his life, which were not vanity, Ecclesiastes, in order to play the part of the spectre. Well, this is news, isn't it? Common assumption is that Shakespeare, yes, he was an actor, and he did want to play parts in the plays that he wrote. So surely he would have wanted to have played the prince, the greatest character, arguably, in the Shakespearean oeuvre. Of course he would play the prince, not the dead king who gets about 5 minutes of speech, but the prince who dominates virtually every scene. But no, Stephen says, he's playing the king. He speaks to Burbage, Richard Burbage, the general leading man of the time in the Shakespearean age, largely because I think he owned a couple of the theatres. And he said, if you want to play in my theatre, you've got to cast me as the leading man. Hamlet, I am thy father's spirit, bidding him to list. And here we get to the point. To a son he speaks, the son of his soul, the prince, young Hamlet, and to the son of his body, Hamnet Shakespeare, who has died in Stratford, that his namesake may live forever. And he goes on. He asks the question, is it possible that the player Shakespeare, a ghost by absence, and in the play in Denmark, a ghost by death, speaking his own words to his own son's name, and then says there in brackets, had Hamlet Shakespeare lived, he would have been 22 years old by the time of the premiere of Hamlet. So the actor Shakespeare feels like he's literally speaking to his dead son, who died aged 11. Is it possible, I want to know, or is it probable? that he did not use the circumstances of his own life in writing the Hamlet play. His son had died too early. Here the actor is speaking. The man Shakespeare is speaking on stage to his son. You are the dispossessed son, i.e. you were taken too soon. I am the murdered father. How is Shakespeare murdered? We know we can explain his death in that he is a ghost, but how is he murdered? We'll have to consider. Your mother is the guilty queen. Well, in the play, this would be Gertrude, who has committed adultery with Prince Hamlet's uncle, Claudius. But who does Stephen say is the guilty queen? And Shakespeare, born Hathaway. So now we are getting interesting, are we not? So is it probable, Stephen asked, that bearing in mind we've got a play called Hamlet, that he had a son called Hamnet, whose names, those two names, I understand, were used interchangeably in Shakespeare's time. So he's named the play effectively after his son. His son lost his birthright through death. Hamlet has lost his birthright through his father's death. Are there any other links we'll go on to establish? But it sounds to me as though there's at least potential for some linkage there. And that might mean that Shakespeare may have wanted to play the ghost and not the prince, so that he could convey certain sentiments to his son. And, you know, for those that might think that Maggie O'Farrell broke new ground in getting into the relationship between William Shakespeare and Anne Hathaway, and the effect on their marriage of the death of their son, aged 11, well, I'm afraid James Joyce got there 100 years before. And I hope it's fairly obvious that we're also thinking about the Blooms, even though Stephen doesn't know he's alluding to them. But we've got Leopold and Molly Bloom, whose son Rudy dies after 11 days, but had he lived, would be 11 years old on his next birthday, and the devastating effect on their marriage, the loss of their son, the gaping hole that was left by the loss of their son. So, you know, the implications of this theory for our book takes on sort of greater interest. So let's move on. We've gone on to page 242, but George Russell is not convinced, and he says, well, it's interesting, yes, only to the parish clerk. We have the plays, we have the poetry of King Lear. What do we care about how the poet actually lived? We read what he wrote. That's what we're interested in. We don't care about the poet's drinking, the poet's debts. I find it interesting that he's used drinking and debts, that Stephen has mentioned those two things anyway. We have King Lear, and it is immortal. Mr. Best agrees with him just by the look on his face. His face was appealed to, and he agreed. Stephen thinks, flow over them with your waves and with your waters. Manannán and Maclear. We met Manannán and Maclear, the sea god located around, operating around the Isle of Man, to which island he gives his name. But this ancient Celtic or Druid type god with 3 legs that skips over the waves. And he thinks of that then because George Russell had written a play and starred in his own play called Deirdre, which Manannán Maclear appears. And I think George Russell may have played him. And he thinks further about George Russell. He goes on to think about that pound he lent you when you were hungry. So George Russell was very nice to James Joyce in a number of ways. in real life. He was the editor of the Irish Homestead, a publication I've talked about before, and he published in that, I think it was The Sisters and An Encounter, the first two stories of Dubliners. That was where they first saw the light of day. And here it seems that George Russell has lent the fictional Joyce, Stephen, a pound. And what did Stephen do with it? He thinks to himself, well, you spent most of it in a prostitute's bed. Georgina Johnson, Agenbite of Inwit, are you now feeling guilty? And now Stephen's monologue splits into two. And before I've mentioned about Joyce's potential schizophrenia. We had a little bit of this in chapter 3, where the conversation went between the 22-year-old James Joyce and the 14 or 15-year-old James Joyce stood in front of a mirror. Certainly Joseph Campbell in, is it Myth and Art or Myth and something, or The Art of James Joyce, he goes to some lengths about why he thinks Joyce displays elements of schizophrenia. And so amidst these conversations going back and forth between the two Stephens, are you going to pay it back? Yes. Well, when? Now? No, not now. When then? I paid my way, thinking of Deasy. Well, hang on. He's from Boyne Water, up there in the northeast of Ireland. Must be near Donegal or Ulster, up that way. The northeast corner, so be Donegal. You owe it. And then wait, 5 months, molecules all change. I'm other now. Other I got pound. He thinks about how our molecules, for the second time he thinks this, he thought it in chapter 3, how our molecules over a 5-month period, they all renew. So the Stephen that got lent the pound isn't the same Stephen as now. Does he still have to pay it back? Bloom thought that as well, didn't he? As he sat there in Davy Burns. Me and me now. Which is the real me? When I was happy then? When I was about 28? Or now 10 years on? I'm 38. I'm not so happy. Which is the me? Form of forms. Am I by memory? Because under ever-changing forms. So back to Plato. Is it the idea you can change your form, but you can't change the essence of you, the real essence, and therefore he remains the same me as the child that in A Portrait of the Artist that Father Conmee saved from further beatings from a pandybat. I, and therefore A-E, I owe you. There we are. So, okay. Eglinton remains suspicious. Do you mean to fly in the face of the tradition of 3 centuries? We consider Anne Hathaway a literary irrelevance. What's she got to do with it now? She died before she was born in literary terms. She died, Stephen says, at 67 years after she was born, and she outlives William Shakespeare. She saw him in and out of the world, and she has his children, and she laid pennies on his eyes at his death. That reminds Stephen of his mother, for whom he didn't say the prayer for the dead, Liliata Rutilantium. Eglinton says of the Shakespeare marriage, Shakespeare made a mistake and got out of it as quickly and as best he could, i.e. ran off to London. Bosh, Stephen says in one of the lines of the book. A man of genius makes no mistakes. His errors are volitional and are the portals of discovery. John Eglinton says, well, a shrew, he says shrewdly, is not a useful portal of discovery, one should imagine. Let's ignore the misogyny and go on to think what he might be getting at. What useful discovery did Socrates learn from Xanthippe? So Xanthippe was Socrates' wife, by all accounts. To use the vernacular that we're now using, she was something of a shrew. She was a forceful, opinionated woman, not somewhat given to henpecking her husband. What did Socrates learn from her? As I say, all rather misogynistic, but let's gloss over that. Well, he learnt dialectic, how to teach, and from his mother, he learnt how to bring thoughts into the world. Socrates' mother was a midwife. But what he learnt from his other wife, Myrto, I don't think a second wife, I think a mistress, and Socratidian's Epipsychidion, taking Shelley's poem Epipsychidion and applying it to Little Socrates. So Little Socrates is little soul. So perhaps his true love, his courtly love in a Dante and Beatrice sort of way, I think is the essence of Epipsychidion, the poem by Shelley. We won't know what he learnt from her. But none of this saved Socrates from the poison that he had to take. And if you don't know, Socrates was sentenced to death by his peers. Not only sentenced to death, but he was condemned to take the poison himself. The archons of Sinn Fein means we ourselves, so our community, I suppose. So whether it was the Athenian or Alexandrian community run by the good burghers of that town, I'm not sure which town it was, but a bit like Sinn Fein is now, Joyce or Stephen is liking it to them. And then over the page, and we're moving on slightly quicker now, but Mr. Best asks, but what's this got to do with Anne Hathaway? Well, yes, we seem to be forgetting her. He looks around the company to the three of them, from George Russell to John Eglinton to Thomas Lister, the guiltless though maligned bald pink Lollard Costard. Well, Stephen goes on to explain. When he leaves Stratford and goes to London, he carries a memory with him. Romville being the Romany word for London, as we learnt in chapter 3. And the memory, let's ignore the earthquake bit and the hair that will be lying in its where it sleeps. The memory he carries with him is that of Venus and Adonis, that wonderful poem Shakespeare wrote about the mortal Adonis and the goddess Venus, and the seduction of the mortal, or the attempted seduction of the mortal by the goddess. Bloom was thinking about this earlier, wasn't he, in Lestrygonians, which led him to go and look at the statues. But he carries a memory of a seduction of a young boy by an older woman. And even though he was something of a playboy once he got to London, and by all accounts was having sex all over the place, he could never dislodge the memory of what the shrew did to him. Why, Stephen asks, would the writer of Antony and Cleopatra, A Passionate Pilgrim, was that a collection of poems, I think? He left her and gained the world of men, but his boy women are the women of a boy. The boy women, i.e. women weren't allowed to play female roles. He chose badly. He was chosen, it seems to me, if others have their will. Anne Hathaway, she was to blame. She put the mother on him, sweet and 26. Anne was 26. Will Shakespeare was 18 when they lay in a cornfield and had sex. And she bends over the boy Adonis, stooping to conquer as a prologue to the swelling act. She is a bald-faced Stratford wench who tumbles in a cornfield a lover younger than herself. The implication being that Will Shakespeare didn't, make of it what you will, but she seduces him. She's the older woman, and as a result, she gets pregnant, and they have to get married. And that this has an effect on on Shakespeare's life that Stephen will explain. But he also thinks, after he's told that story, and my turn, when? I'd quite like to be tumbled in a field, in a cornfield by an older woman. But yes, he'll have to wait his turn. Richard Best pipes up. Raphael, he says in his Ulster accent. Mr. Best said, brightly, gladly, raising his new book, gladly, brightly. So he's rather pedantically contradicting Stephen's claim that they had sex in a cornfield. He says it wasn't a cornfield, it was a rye field. And I think he's quoting, he's taking the line from the song in As You Like It, Hey Nonny No. But I think Gifford makes the point that same song says both cornfield and rye field. So they both might be right. Paris, the well-pleased pleaser. Paris, why Paris? Paris, Helen. In chapter 3, Stephen thought about Paris and as the sun was coming up in Paris and the well-pleased pleasers, those men with the long sideburns walking past the bakery. Right, at this point, a tall figure in bearded homespun, so this is George Russell, he gets up from the shadow of his lamp and unveils his cooperative watch. I'm afraid I'm due at the Homestead, the Homestead being his newspaper. Whither away, Stephen thinks, exploitable ground. He talked about the exploitable ground just before, didn't he, with the Phaeacians. John Eglinton's active eyebrows asked, are you going? Shall we see you at Moore's tonight? Piper is coming. Oh, Piper, Mr. Best. Is Piper back? Did he live in Paris, I think? Stephen thinks, Peter Piper pecked a peck of pickled pepper. I don't know if I can. Thursday, we have our meeting. If I can get away in time. Now, before getting on to the next paragraph, it seems that what we will learn, I think maybe on 246, is that George Moore is having a party that night with lots of literary people coming, and the gist of all of this, and this meeting in the library really happened with Joyce. And Joyce wasn't invited to this party. And here Eglinton is saying in front of Stephen about this party, he goes on to say, oh, I think Mulligan is coming, and yes, everyone's going to be there. It's really a bit rude to say all this in front of Stephen when he's not being invited. Anyway, we'll get there. George Russell isn't, and it's really all the great and the good of the Irish literary revival. Most of the people that Joyce was to write so scathingly about in the poem The Holy Office. But part of that scathing may have been because out of a bit of envy about how they wouldn't really let him into their crowd. He wrote about, yes, they write about all these pure things. They leave it to me to write about cloacal drainage, all their waste matter. I have to deal with that art because they're not prepared to go there. But before thinking that, he thinks about this next paragraph. Stephen thinks, Yogi Bogey Box in Dawson Chambers. ISIS unveiled their pally book we tried to pawn. Look, lots of stuff in there. Reference to poets, T. Caulfield, Irwin. But generally it's about the Hermetists. He can't go because it's his meeting this evening. And it's everyone seems to know it's the Theosophist meeting. So I don't think we need to go into all of that in that paragraph. It's Theosophy. The Hermetists. If you want to know about the Hermetists, read the book by Francis Yates. What's it called? Hermes Trismegistus. No. Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic Tradition, Francis Yates. There we are, very good. And not only is there this party going on, but there's also, the librarian says, and I believe we're going to have a literary surprise. Mr. Russell, rumour has it, is gathering together a sheaf of our younger poets' verses. We're all looking forward anxiously. And again, this happened in real life, and Joyce wasn't included. You know, and this was really, if you think back to Ireland at that time, anyone that was anyone tended to be Protestant. Catholics were only allowed to start going to school from 1800, so it's going to be, and it's barely 100 years before, so it's going to take a while for the Catholic intelligentsia to develop, to start going through school, to university. They had to create their own university. They weren't allowed in Trinity. And all of this comes, so all of the great revolutionaries of the time and the previous 100 years, the vast majority of that, and certainly the literary elite, you know, the Wildes and Sheridan and George Bernard Shaw and all the people we've been hearing about this evening, invariably they're Protestant. So I can't even remember why I'm saying any of this now, but yeah, Joyce was one of the first of this new breed of young Catholics to be pushing through to create this new generation of artistic talent. But he wasn't included in this book by George Russell, whom I'm assuming was a Protestant. Not that that was relevant to George Russell, but there it is. And what does Stephen think? See this, remember. Well, he does remember. He remembers these two slights, the slight of not being invited to the party and the slight of not being included in the book, and he gets his revenge. He's written it in this book, in Ulysses. So here it is for eternity. He then, for reasons I'm not sure why, carries out Aristotle's experiment, which is where he touches his ash plant and his hat with two fingers. So if you touch something with two fingers but without looking at it, you don't know if it's one object or two, because each finger independently is going to send signals back to the brain saying, well, there's an object. It's only when you look at it and your eyes can clarify what's going on that you know it's two objects. Whether he is talking about sort of like yes, it's my casque and sword, that he's continuing the battle. He is not going to be left on the periphery by these potentially snobbish people that are keeping James A. Joyce and Stephen Dedalus on the outside. And then they go on to talk about this party that's going on, and it's a whole mix of conversation, as quite often happens. One of them get up to leave. There's then a jumble of conversation. It's generally about the party, and there's jokes there about Susan Mitchell and George Moore and Martin, and how Moore and Martin are likened to Quixote and Sancho Panza. I don't think this is a lot of, you know, you wonder, how did Joyce expect people to know what the hell this was about? This is local flotsam and jetsam in Dublin at the time. Yes, these are important figures, but I'm not sure where it's taking the story. James Stephens, an incredibly important figure, who, when Joyce was losing his sight, I think it must be this same James Stephens who had moved to Paris, volunteered to sit with Joyce and write Finnegan's Wake at his dictation if Joyce needed. In the end, I don't think Joyce needed it, but he was absolutely obsessed with Joyce. But Steve's got a task to do for DC. So at the bottom of page 246, he stands up and he says, and he has to be super polite in his best French polish, "Oh, Mr. Russell, if you wouldn't mind, could you hand this to Mr. Norman, the editor of the Irish Homestead? This letter I have from Mr. Deasy, it's about foot and mouth. That would be a subject very close to the heart of the Irish Homestead, which is sort of an agricultural-looking periodical. Yes, and hopefully that will get published. Oh, I perhaps ought to mention the reference to George Roberts in that paragraph on 246. George Roberts is doing the commercial part. This was the publisher of Dubliners. Did he end up actually publishing it? It went on for a decade, and Joyce had huge rows with him about what could be included and what could not be included. So it's not his only mention in the book. There was reference, I think, earlier or at some point to Molly when she's undressing after a party one time. Oh, I know when it was. It was in Calypso, and he's wondering about if he could send a story to Titbits about the sayings of Molly Bloom. He recalls her talking about George Roberts. Anyway, not much in that. Okay, so we're on 247. So we've reached the final page in which I'm going to provide commentary today. So George Russell takes the letter. Yes, if he considers it important, it will go in. Stephen rather insultingly thinks the pig's paper, Bullock befriending. He remembers as he came away from Garrett Deasy having agreed to take the 2 copies of the letters to get published, that Mulligan will rename him the Bullock befriending bard. Eglinton says, Sing has promised me an article for Dana too. John Millington Sing. Are we going to be read? I feel we are. So the Gaelic revival was really just getting going. And yes, I hope you'll come round tonight. Bring Starkey. So more talk about this party from which Stephen is ostracised. Stephen sits down. The Quaker librarian, having said goodbye to Russell, comes back and he says, Mr. Dedalus, your views are most illuminating, and creaking to and fro, tiptoeing nearer heaven by the altitude of a chopine. Chopine was sort of a platform. I think it was generally a ladies' platform. Soul. I think there's a line in Hamlet about one of the boy women. Hamlet says to him, I think you're, the play within the play bit, I think you're taller than when I last saw you. You've increased by the size of a chopine. But the librarian says, is it your view then that she was not faithful to the poet? Alarmed face asks me, why did he come? Courtesy or an inward light? An inward light being a Quaker thing. Well, Stephen says, if there is reconciliation, there must have been first a sundering. So Giordano Bruno, this idea that everything in the universe goes backwards and forwards like a pendulum, like this, expands, contracts. If you're together, you must have been apart. And once you're together, you're going to go apart again. It's the natural order of the universe. Right, Christ Fox in leather trews. This is Stephen looking at the Quaker librarian and thinking about the founder of the Quaker movement, someone Fox. Was it Charles Fox? I can't remember, but it was someone Fox. And he's likened to Christ here, Christ Fox in leather trews, because he goes on the run. I think he was alive, maybe it was Shakespeare's time or a bit after. People weren't so keen on religious diversity then, and he had to go on the run. I think around sort of Leicestershire. I'm not sure where I've got that from. Hiding in the countryside, where leather trousers probably very useful. Knowing no vixen, i.e. wasn't married, walking lonely in the chase, but he attracted women he won to him, tender people, a whore of Babylon, ladies of justices. So these are actually the women he ended up marrying quite later in life. The widow of a justice, prostitute, fallen ladies were tended to be attracted to the Quakers. Fox and Geese, is that the name of a pub he ended up in, but it's a bit of a double entendre there. And in New Place, i.e. back in Stratford, where the Shakespeares lived and where Anne Hathaway was left on her own, a slack, dishonoured body that was once comely. So we're now thinking of a time when Anne Hathaway is not 26 anymore. She's not 36 or 46 even. Maybe she's about 56. She died, I think they said 67 years after her birth. So yes, let's say she's now in her mid-50s. Now her leaves falling, all bare, frightened of the narrow grave and unforgiven, she knows that she has sinned. So the suggestion is that she has been unfaithful. She's living up to the Gertrude in Hamlet, who has been unfaithful, who has created the beast with two backs with her brother-in-law, her erstwhile brother-in-law, Claudius, and now husband. The question remains, with whom has Anne Hathaway been faithful? So then the Quaker librarian continues, yes, so you think, and then the door closed behind the outgoer. George Russell has gone. That seems like a suitable moment for me to conclude this rather mammoth commentary. As I say, I've gone into much more detail than I normally would, but I think to get us off to a good start in this most difficult of chapters, perhaps it's worthwhile. If you're hearing this and you're not part of my normal group, then do feel free to get in touch. The main website is patreon.com/North London Ulysses. But we also have a Facebook page, or if you happen to be anywhere near North London, reach out to me and I'll give you details of the pub. We meet once a week and I'll be doing these readings live, and it would be fantastic to see you. The idea of the Patreon page is that you could be anywhere in the world and catch up by seeing the previous videos, which will assist your private reading, and then you can get up to us in real time or go at your own pace as you wish. Okay, so I'll leave it there, and thank you very much for watching and listening. Bye-bye.